Well, hi everyone. It's Marsha Sinetar again, and this time with a mailbag question about how you influence a group or organization for the better. It's a leadership issue. It's a natural challenge for every real, I would say, born leader, and we can learn it. So I'm going to share three ideas. These are biases. They're not necessarily techniques. I'm not a formula person, in case you hadn't noticed, but I want to begin with a story, and the story comes to me from a Franciscan friend. It takes place in the Middle Ages, and it's about a young man who aspires to be a master blacksmith, a real craftsman. And so he thinks to himself that he's better find a master in order to learn from him or her. But in the Middle Ages, it would have been him. So he does find one. He goes to the master blacksmith and he says, Sir, I want to become a master craftsman just like you. And the elder looks at the younger and he says, well, let's see what you're made of. You stand here. He hands him a piece of iron and he says, you just hold it. So he holds it, and he holds it for the whole day. End of the day, he goes home. Next day, the young man returns. Same thing. This goes on for weeks. Finally, the young man comes back. The blacksmith gives him a piece of iron. He says, stand here. He does. End of the day, the young man turns to the blacksmith and he says, you know, there's something different about this piece of iron from yesterday's. And the blacksmith says to him, okay, son, you're in. You're my apprentice because you saw the difference between one piece of iron and another. Okay, here's the point in context of what I'm talking about, of what we're looking at. And it has to do with being so sensitive to the field in which we're in, the state in which we're in, what we're involved with, absorbed with, focused on. So sensitive with that heightened awareness that we can spot the nuance, the subtlety of whatever it is that we're doing. And I would suggest to you that this is very, very contemplative, and that it is the natural perceptual field of the true leader, that the true leader is someone that can spot these subtle changes in the environment, the group, the family, the organizational field, let's say. And this begins my, let's call it, overarching biases. So we're going to look at leadership from the context of, first, the contemplative mind. Well, before moving ahead, I'd like to just clarify the difference in my mind between changing a corporate or group culture and facilitating a group. I would see the facilitation of a group as a subset, and there are very defined skills for that, not just personal qualifications, which involve things like being able to listen, being able to draw people out, not necessarily polarizing the group, solving a problem, taking care of certain staff development issues. It's more of a management activity. Whereas changing a culture of a group is really a leadership function. It's a function of influence and shaping and arranging the view of that group so that everyone is kind of looking in the same direction. And I'm going to use that phrase several times because I think it's critical. So in certain examples that I'll give you down the line as we move forward here, you're going to hear me describe a couple of leadership traits that are not necessarily people-oriented, because the leader is sometimes very much involved in a bigger vision than are the skills of group facilitation. The leader might be abrupt. The leader might be manipulative. It's hard to say because there's so many different types of leaders. But it's certainly more than a management issue. Well, because this is not a management course that I'm going to try to address here, just a short answer, relatively speaking, I want to refer you to an article by Abraham Zalesnik, just like it sounds, Zalesnik. And it's Managers and Leaders, Are They Different? He also has other articles. They're online. You can get them, or you can read an abstract. But he makes the point, and this is my point as well, that there is a difference between managers and leaders. Leaders seem to be driven by some inner call, a large vision. You think about a Bill Gates, a Warren Buffett, Elon Musk, people like that who are business geniuses. And at the same time, they're not really fit into the organization as much as they try to fit the organization for their long-term vision. Zalesnik and others have compared this to managers being in charge of process and leaders more about vision, long-term, future vision. So enough said about that, but there are differences. And so when we talk about changing a corporate culture, I am surely talking about leadership and not about management. So we're talking about how to change group thinking, let's say, the organizational culture. These are ideas that we're dealing with, basically. People's receptivity to something new, to something long-term, to something ambiguous, to something that's uncomfortable because it is new. And so I made the point at the beginning, it's not a how-to formula. But there is a connection, as I said, to the contemplative mind. So the first thing let's do, this is number one. I want to talk a little bit, just a little bit, about the relationship between leadership and that deep contemplative thought pattern that has the ability to see the whole and the fragment. Whereas most of us see the fragment. We go fact by fact. We might be uncomfortable with ambiguity. Whereas the gifted leader, the one who can change a corporate culture or a group culture, be it a family, over a cup of coffee, whatever, that individual tends to see the largest possible scope and the fragment, and can tolerate the unknown, and go for long periods of time without closure. Whereas the average person will need that closure right away. Like in a meeting, they'll want the answer right away, and they'll take a side instead of just waiting. So my first idea is that this contemplative mind is a leader mind, leadership mind, a leadership gift, let's call it. It's centered, it's coherent, calm, but the big factor is that through our contemplative practices or our natural way of being, we come into that expanded perception, that raised awareness. And it doesn't come by the groupthink way of being. It really does have something to do with what I've called before the law of our being. I remember a story about Gandhi when he was a young boy. He refused to play with others unless he could be the leader, and he loved to play alone. And he loved to give direction, and he knew how to give the direction, and people let him do it. His age mates let him do that. The same seemed to be true of the painter Georgia O'Keeffe. And I remember long ago when I wrote some leadership papers, thinking about these young people who show that deeply reflective mind. So my first idea is that whatever our group, whatever the situation that we want to change, the best way, this is my bias, you think about your own biases, the best way to begin is to center ourselves, get a hold of our deepest convictions about something, but try to see the whole picture, the whole lay of the land, and the fragment. The fragment is what confronts us now, but the deepest picture is the wide-angle lens on a situation. And to me, that's why the contemplative practice, prayer, meditation, contemplation, many of the things we've talked about on this archive lead us to a natural ability to size up the energy of a group and become very, very sensitive to the right time and the right way to introduce new ideas. So I want to spend another minute here talking about organizational leadership, group sensitivity. Whereas before, I was speaking about the contemplative mind, reflective, thoughtful, sees the whole wide-angle picture of a situation. But those qualities can apply to, let's say, a parent, an artist, an inventor, a scientist, and yet these people with special gifts and special contemplative insight into their field, their engrossment, their specific area of fascination, they may not have that same sensitivity for organizations. So what I'm talking about, for the most part, in this mailbag answer is organizational talent that is rooted in the ability to be reflective and thoughtful and tolerate ambiguity for long periods of time without needing closure, that has the maturity that most people in an organization will want to follow, will trust, will seek out for advice, confidences, and so forth. Now, there are other traits. For example, there's that maturity factor that I mentioned. The person with talent in an organization, let's say they're brilliant at accounting, they may also be reactive, easily frustrated. I call it a kind of immaturity, which, by the way, I've shown from time to time in my own life. So we're not talking here about perfect people. We're talking about individuals with depth and many sides. And it's the dominant aspect of giftedness in group leadership, group influence that we're talking about in this answer. So I want to move on to the second idea. The second idea has to do with interactive skill, and particularly in a group setting. Informally, the group dynamic, informal meetings of some sort. Now, this could be so various. It could be the Q&A section at the end of a staff meeting. It could be a staff development meeting. Again, maybe some kind of brainstorming. But the idea here is to utilize the energy, the facets of group dynamic to introduce a point of view, a world view, let's say, or an organizational view, to say something like, well, let's hear what you all think about thus and such. And to the extent that the person running the group, the facilitator, has talent, finesse, sensitivity, like in the beginning when I spoke about the apprentice who was very, very sensitive, who grew over time, very sensitive to the feeling of a piece of iron. That quality in a facilitator, be it a formal facilitator, someone who's hired in as a consultant to run a group, or the department head, or a staff member. That individual, if they don't have unique gifts in this regard, and I really don't know if it can be trained. I think it's more like a natural, intuitive, instinctual understanding of the dynamic, the energy, the vibe, let's call it, of a group. Within that context, within that group, it's a perfect time to introduce new ideas, to get a feel for what's going on, to start shaping and arranging a vision for the future, for that group, for the organization. And in a way, it's the most natural thing in the world. At the bottom of the video, in the blurb or text, I'm going to put a link to one of my own articles. It's a way that I've worked for years and years with organizations. And I have to say, modesty aside, I have a knack for it. I seem to understand, and I was never trained in this, and that's why I made the point. And as I said earlier, it's a bias. The point that I'm not sure it can be taught. I'm not sure you can go to a weekend seminar or even an MBA program and learn it from a textbook. I think you have to have a feel for people, a liking of people, a kind of baseline understanding of where Joe or Mary or that clique in the corner is coming from, and also a finesse on how you reach them, how you talk to them. So within the context of that group dynamic is a perfect opportunity for influence and leadership of a very subtle, a very respectful kind. I'd like to say another word about this idea that we can't be trained. That's not entirely accurate. We can be sensitized in an area that we're not familiar with, and we can grow our talent in facilitation of the group dynamic, yes. I don't think it can happen overnight. I think it takes a great deal of time and sensitizing. But in addition to that, there has to be a ground level capacity to understand people. Almost everybody can grow in that skill. Some people, like the bull in the china shop, cannot. And I'm sorry to say that the kind of, shall we say, change agent that the informal group can be happens with a skillful leader at the helm. That's what I'm trying to say. Whether we can grow in that, I believe we can. Can we grow to the extent that we can be natural leaders? I don't know. That's something for you to take a look at in your own life. For myself, when I was a new principal, for example, I think I was in my late 20s when I became a principal. Maybe middle 20s, I'm not sure. But I was the youngest one in a group of people that were pretty much ready to retire, most of them. And I think they had a raised eyebrow. Who is this that is trying to take over our organizational view? Over time, I did go to programs. I went to something called the Kharkov training, Carhuff. I think it's still in existence. It was an empathy training, and it went over months. I went to sensitivity training. But beneath all of that, in addition to hearing how people felt about the I message, the you message, the new ideas that were being introduced, the dominant aspect of my way of being with them, in addition to all of that, there was this liking of people. And I think it came from a family situation when I was very young. So we're talking about ideas for improving or enhancing a group culture. And the first point that I made, the first idea that I offered, is that there is a similarity between the whole seeing of that contemplative mind and the natural leader's mind. That regardless of the occupation, be it science, invention, crafts, parenting, or organization, there is a kind of perceptual difference between the leader and the manager, between the leader and the staff, let's say, the average person in the staff. The second idea is this ability that some people have of using the group itself as the change agent. It's almost as if the group becomes a person, one body, let's say. And this is very spiritual, very mystical, and it relates to the principle that when we're all of us looking in the same direction, doesn't mean we're all the same. It doesn't mean we're all fawning over each other, all, shall we say, patting each other on the back, but we are all looking in the same direction. Magical things can happen. Wonderful things can happen in a group. So the third idea is kind of the secret sauce. And the secret sauce is more contradictory than even the other things that I've mentioned. And it has to do with really liking people. I mentioned this before. I'm going to mention it again. It does not mean that we are needing approval of the group. Liking people does not mean that we want them to like us. It means that we are loyal in a deep, abiding, spiritual sense to the welfare of the greater good. I want to reference a couple of TV shows. I think these are streaming. You can watch them on your computer or phone. One is Nero Wolfe, the most recent Nero Wolfe. I think they were produced in around the 80s with the actor, I think his name is pronounced Maury Shokin. Excellent. And he's very abrupt. He's rude. He's solitary. He's very idiosyncratic. At the same time, his gifts make him sort of plod on and be successful with other people. They follow him. They trust him. They flock to him. The same can be said of the character played in Doc, D-O-C, about a doctor in a small British village. Same thing. Tremendously talented, but not really full of people skills. How does this contradict what I said earlier about learning? Well, over time we see these characters break through certain difficulties that they have with people. But the same thing, the same rule applies, and that rule is that other people trust them, despite all of the hard edges, the rough edges, the idiosyncratic methods. These individuals, because they like people underneath it all, because they're working for the others, for a vision that benefits the whole, others trust them, flock to them. There's something I should add about this idea of using the informal group as a change agent, that we're making our organizational or group influence, change, enhancement through the group, not only of ourselves, but the group is doing a lot of the work for us because we're all looking in the same direction. So I have a story about that. I hesitate to tell it, but I think I will. When I was new in my leadership development firm, and it lasted for about 30 years. I went from being in the public sector into the private sector on my own. I talk about this, I think, in my autobiography. At any rate, I had a small group of, well, I think they were mostly lawyers and a couple of PhD economists and people of that nature, of that highly educated nature, and it was a corporate client that was very prestigious, and everybody but me was extremely polished in American business. So this is one of my first groups. I sensed that they were with me, but not 100%. There was still a little bit of wondering, who is this person and what's she all about and are we being sold a bill of goods like that? So it was around Mother's Day, right before the Mother's Day weekend, and we were all saying goodbye to each other. We were still seated in the session. We had just finished, and someone said to me, Marsha, do you have kids? Do you have children? And I said, no, I don't have them. And a silence fell over the group as, as a sort of awkwardness. People didn't know what to say. And finally, in the corner of my eye, I see one man, I think a lawyer, who pipes up and he says, well, Marsha, you have us, and we know it. And I knew what he meant, and everybody knew what he meant. He meant that between myself and the group, even at that early stage, there was a kind of harmony based on the fact that I really loved them, not in a cloying, ingratiating kind of way, but I wanted so much for the best for them, for the best for that organization, and we all knew it. So from that moment on, the group was attuned to the ideas I was talking about, because in the love that had been mentioned, that was never mentioned again, that people understood, intuitively understood and wanted, and we all love that because it's so healthy, so wholesome. And because of that, we were all on the same wavelength, we were looking in the same direction, and quite frankly, from then on, other groups followed suit. We were able to make some wonderful enhancements in that organization. Well, let me wrap this up with a story about my father. My father, during World War II, was living in Asia, China, and the whole family was. My father was in business at the time in China when the Japanese invaded China and took many, not all, many American businessmen, primarily community leaders, into what amounts to concentration camp. These were called prisoner of war camps, but they were brutal. And I'm convinced that my dad survived, whereas many, many, I think 30,000, if not more, Americans, or at least the Allied citizens, perished. And they perished in horrible circumstances from what I've read, and I frankly don't want to read any more about it. At any rate, the traits that my dad had, I believe, contributed to his survival. And it goes something like this. First of all, he had that whole-seeing perspective, the ability, as I think William Blake has said, to see eternity in a grain of sand. And he also had the ability to see his situation within that whole picture. The second thing is that my dad was extremely gifted with people. Unlike the couple of examples I gave previously, he had that knack of understanding the way a group or even an individual works without being manipulative or condescending or pretentious about it. He was just very easygoing, comfortable to be with, and basically people trusted him. As I said, they followed him. The other trait that he had to do with this secret sauce, this ability to really enjoy people. In his case, he loved the Asian culture, loved the Japanese as a people, and admired the Japanese culture as a whole. I remember years later my mother saying, and it epitomized his attitude as well, that those who imprisoned him and the others were just boys at the time. So there was that understanding of how war can cripple us emotionally and make us do things we would never do. And I think that because my dad loved the Japanese people and the Japanese culture, he spoke a little Japanese, he also spoke Cantonese, Mandarin. You know, he had that sensitivity to their way of being, and it shone through his way of being. I think they picked that up and they sensed it. They intuitively knew. And maybe within the interaction with him, I'll never know, no one will ever know, but maybe within that interaction, they let him live. They treated him a little less badly. Not well, but maybe a little less badly, and that's my hope. And I end with this thought from John W. Gardner, former Health, Education, and Welfare Secretary. He makes the point, and I'm paraphrasing, that our true happiness, joy, if you will, resides in our development of innate and inborn talent and its power. That power comes from the development of our talent, which, as I've suggested, it may not be a quick fix, it may not be a beautifully well-developed talent, but talent nonetheless, developed nonetheless through our doing. Lifelong learning. Thanks for listening.